Number 1. YNW Melly. In the world of hip-hop, authenticity is the most valuable currency a potentially famous artist can possess. Fans want to believe that the stories of struggle, violence, and survival they hear in the lyrics are real. But there is a terrifying line where art stops imitating life and starts documenting a crime scene. We are investigating the 10 most shocking cases where rappers didn't just write about the violence of the streets, they enacted it, turning their hit songs into confessions and their music videos into evidence. If you believe that the truth behind the music deserves to be told, please subscribe to this channel right now to join our community of investigators and hit the like button to support this deep dive into the dark side of the industry. The story of Jamel Demons, known to the world as YNW Melly, is perhaps the most chilling example of life imitating art in the history of modern music. In 2018, Melly was not just a rising star, he was a supernova, exploding out of Gifford, Florida. He had a unique voice, a melodic flow that blended pain and aggression, and a charisma that attracted millions of fans. But his breakout hit, the song that made him a household name, was a haunting track titled "Murder on My Mind." In the song, Melly croons beautifully about waking up with the urge to kill, describing in graphic detail the accidental shooting of a friend and the feeling of watching him die. At the time, fans viewed it as a dark, artistic expression of the trauma of the streets, a metaphorical masterpiece. But as the months went on, that song would transform from a platinum record into what prosecutors believe is a blueprint for a double homicide that shocked the rap world to its core. The victims were not rival gang members or enemies. They were his day ones, his best friends, the people who had supported him before the fame and the money. Their names were Anthony Williams, known as YNW Sack Chaser, and Christopher Thomas Jr., known as YNW Juvie. They were part of the YNW Collective, a brotherhood that was supposed to last forever. But on a dark Florida night in October, that brotherhood was dissolved by bullets fired from inside their own sanctuary. The timeline of the alleged crime reads like a horror movie script. On the night of October 26, 2018, Melly, Sack Chaser, and Juvie were at a recording studio in Fort Lauderdale. The vibe was reportedly normal. They were working, laughing, and preparing for the next stage of their careers. In the early hours of the morning, the group decided to leave. They piled into a Jeep Compass. Melly sat in the back seat on the left side. Sack Chaser and Juvie were also in the vehicle, along with the driver, Cortland Henry, known as YNW Bortlin. What happened inside that Jeep as it traveled through the desolate swampland of Miramar is the subject of a capital murder trial that has gripped the nation. According to the initial story told by YNW Bortlin, the group was the victim of a tragic drive-by shooting. He claimed that a car pulled up alongside them and opened fire, spraying the Jeep with bullets and killing Sack Chaser and Juvie. Bortlin drove the bullet-ridden Jeep to the emergency room of Memorial Hospital Miramar, arriving with the bodies of his two friends. It was a heartbreaking scene, another case of young talent extinguished by random street violence. The hip-hop community mourned. YNW Melly posted tributes to his brothers on Instagram, expressing his devastation and grief. He played the part of the survivor perfectly. But the police investigators were not listening to the music. They were looking at the physics. As forensic experts examined the Jeep Compass, the drive-by story began to unravel with terrifying speed. The bullet holes on the outside of the car didn't make sense. A drive-by shooting typically results in a spray of bullets moving from the outside in, often at a downward or horizontal angle. But the ballistics report suggested something impossible. The fatal shots that killed Sack Chaser and Juvie had entered their bodies from a specific angle that originated from inside the car. Specifically, the shots came from the rear left passenger seat, the exact seat where YNW Melly had been sitting. Furthermore, the investigators found a shell casing inside the vehicle, a piece of evidence that rarely lands inside a car during a drive-by. The police began to reconstruct the scene, and a new, sinister theory emerged. They believed that Melly and Bortlen had driven to a secluded area in the Everglades. There, in the quiet darkness, Melly allegedly pulled out a handgun and shot his two best friends in the back and the head, executing them while they were trapped in the car. The drive-by was a stage play. After the murders, prosecutors alleged that Melly and Bortlen drove around with the bodies for a period of time, perhaps hours. They then allegedly stopped the car, got out, and fired shots into the outside of the Jeep to stage the drive-by scene, trying to cover up the internal execution. It was a cold, calculated attempt to fool the authorities. The motive remains the biggest mystery. Was it greed? Jealousy? A dispute over money or credit within the YNW group? Or was it, as the song Murder on My Mind suggested, a dark, psychological compulsion? The investigation deepened when cell phone data placed Melly at the scene of the crime, contradicting his alibi. The police pieced together a digital map of the night, tracking the movement of the phones from the studio to the swamp to the hospital. When the arrest warrant was finally issued in February 2019, the charge was 2 counts of first-degree murder. The state of Florida did not just want a conviction. They announced they would seek the death penalty. The trial, which began years later, was a spectacle. The prosecution played Murder on My Mind in the courtroom, arguing that the lyrics were not art, but a confession or a premonition. They showed videos of Melly acting erratically, trying to paint a picture of a cold-blooded killer. The defense argued that there was no gun found, no DNA on the trigger, and that the state's case was purely circumstantial. The first trial ended in a mistrial, with the jury unable to reach a unanimous verdict, leaving Melly in a legal purgatory, still behind bars, still facing the possibility of execution.
Number 2. Tay-K. In the summer of 2017, a song exploded onto the internet that became the anthem of a generation raised on chaos and social media clout. It was called The Race, and it was catchy, aggressive, and undeniably raw, racking up millions of views in a matter of days. The video showed a baby-faced teenager, Tamor McIntyre, known as Tay-K, waving a handgun next to his own wanted poster, bragging about running from the police. To the millions of fans who danced to it on TikTok and blasted it from car stereos, it was the ultimate expression of rebellion, a catchy tune about beating the system. But The Race wasn't just a song, it was a real-time confession, a documentary of a violent fugitive spree that left a trail of blood and broken families across the state of Texas. This is the story of a 17-year-old who treated Grand Theft Auto like a lifestyle guide, a boy who turned his crimes into content and his victims into footnotes in his viral fame. To understand the tragedy of Tay-K, you have to go back to the night that started the run, a night that had nothing to do with music and everything to do with a cold-blooded setup. On July 26, 2016, in the quiet suburb of Mansfield, Texas, 21-year-old Ethan Walker was at home playing video games with his friends. He was a low-level marijuana dealer, a kid who thought he was safe in his own living room, but he was being targeted. 2 female accomplices, who were friends with Tay-K, had entered the house earlier, acting as scouts, unlocking a door and signaling the crew waiting outside. Tay-K and a group of 6 other associates, dressed in black and armed with guns, stormed the house in a botched robbery attempt that turned lethal in seconds. The plan was simple: steal the drugs and the money, but the reality was a panic-fueled disaster. When the intruders confronted Ethan Walker, he reportedly raised his hands, trying to comply or perhaps trying to defend himself. It didn't matter. One of Tay-K's associates fired. Ethan Walker was shot in the stomach, collapsing on the floor of the house he shared with his family. The crew fled, leaving him to die for a small amount of cash and drugs. Tay-K was arrested shortly after and charged with capital murder. Because he was a juvenile, he was placed under house arrest while awaiting a certification hearing that would determine if he would be tried as an adult. He was trapped in his home, an ankle monitor strapped to his leg, facing a life sentence before he was even old enough to vote. Most people in that situation would be terrified, preparing for a legal battle. Tay-K decided to run. On March 26, 2017, he cut off his ankle monitor. He tweeted a final message to the world, "Fuck it, imuts," a misspelled declaration that he was out. He vanished, and that is when the race truly began. While he was a fugitive, actively hunted by the U.S. Marshal Service, he didn't lay low. He went into the studio. He recorded the song that detailed exactly what he was doing, running from the law. The lyrics were a direct taunt to the authorities, bragging about beating the case and doing the race. He filmed the music video while on the run, posing with the very gun he was carrying for protection. But the run wasn't just about making music. It was about survival by any means necessary, and for Tay-K, that meant escalating violence. He fled to San Antonio, Texas, and on April 23, 2017, the fun and games of the music video turned into another grim reality. Tay-K and his associates targeted a 23-year-old photographer named Mark Anthony Saldivar. They stole his camera equipment and forced him out of his car. Saldivar wasn't going to let them take his livelihood without a fight. He jumped onto the hood of his vehicle to try and stop them from driving away. It was a desperate act of bravery. Tay-K, sitting in the vehicle, allegedly rolled down the window. He didn't drive off. He pulled out a handgun and shot Saldivar. The photographer fell from the hood and died in the parking lot of a Chick-fil-A. It was a senseless, brutal murder committed for a camera bag. But Tay-K didn't stop there. A month later, he attacked a 65-year-old man named Skip Pepe in Arlington's Cravens Park. He beat the elderly man unconscious, leaving him with brain bleeds and broken bones just to steal his wallet. He was a one-man crime wave, a teenager with no moral compass and a gun, leaving a wake of destruction wherever he went. The law finally caught up with him on June 30, 2017. U.S. Marshals tracked him to Elizabeth, New Jersey. He had made it halfway across the country, but his luck had run out. He was arrested without incident, finally ending the race. But while he was sitting in a jail cell, his song was blowing up. The race climbed the Billboard charts, certified platinum. Celebrities were tweeting the lyrics. The world was dancing to the confession of a double murderer. It was a surreal, dystopian moment in pop culture where the crime fueled the fame and the fame financed the legal defense for the crime. But in the courtroom, the music stopped. The prosecutors didn't see a rap star, they saw a predator. They used the lyrics of the race not as art, but as evidence of his state of mind, proof that he had no remorse, that he viewed his flight from justice as a game. They showed the jury the video of him waving the gun next to his wanted poster. They showed the photos of Ethan Walker and Mark Anthony Saldivar. The defense tried to argue that Tay-K was just a kid influenced by older gang members, that he wasn't the triggerman in the first murder. But the law in Texas is clear. If you are part of the felony that leads to a death, you are responsible for the murder. The jury found him guilty of murder in the death of Ethan Walker. In July 2019, Tamor McIntyre was sentenced to 55 years in prison. He was also fined $10,000. He still faces a separate capital murder trial for the death of Mark Anthony Saldivar in San Antonio, where prosecutors could potentially seek even harsher penalties. The boy who rapped about beating the case lost everything. He will be an old man before he is even eligible for parole. Tay-K's story is the ultimate tragedy of the clout era, a horrifying example of what happens when the lines between entertainment and reality are completely erased. He didn't just write lyrics, he wrote his own prison sentence bar by bar, bullet by bullet, proving that in the real world, you can't outrun the consequences of pulling the trigger, no matter how fast your flow is. He gained the world's attention for a few months, but the price was his entire life.
Number 3. C Murder. In the late 1990s, there was no force in hip-hop more dominant, more lucrative, or more terrifying than No Limit Records. Based in New Orleans, the label was a tank, literally and figuratively,
driven by Master P, a business genius who took the raw, unfiltered violence of the Calliope projects and sold it to the suburbs, generating hundreds of millions of dollars. But while Master P was the CEO and the brains, his younger brother, Corey Miller, was the muscle. He chose a stage name that wasn't a metaphor, wasn't a play on words, and wasn't a character. He called himself C-Murder. He claimed it stood for C-Murder, as in, he had seen many things growing up in the projects, but to the public and the police, it felt like a promise. His music was darker, grittier, and more menacing than anyone else on the label. He rapped about homicides, about drive-bys, about the cold reality of taking a life with a conviction that made listeners uncomfortable. He was the enforcer of the no-limit tank, a man who lived the lifestyle of a gangster rapper to its absolute limit. But on a cold January night in 2002, the line between the persona and the person evaporated completely in a nightclub in Harvey, Louisiana, resulting in the death of a teenage fan who had idolized the very man who took his life. This is the story of a self-fulfilling prophecy, a name that became a verdict, and a millionaire superstar who threw away an empire to bully a 16-year-old boy. To understand the death of Steve Thomas, you have to understand the atmosphere of New Orleans in the early 2000s. It was a city plagued by corruption and violence, where police officers were often as dangerous as the criminals, and where no-limit soldiers were treated like royalty. C-Murder walked through the city with impunity. He didn't get searched at clubs. He didn't wait in lines. On January 12, 2002, C-Murder entered the Platinum Club. It was a local hotspot, crowded, loud, and filled with the smoke and energy of a Saturday night. He wasn't alone. He was surrounded by an entourage, a wall of muscle and intimidation. In that same club was Steve Thomas. Steve wasn't a gangster. He was a kid. He was 16 years old, a huge fan of C-Murder, and an aspiring rapper himself who went by the name Lil Steve. He had used a fake ID to get into the club, hoping to catch a glimpse of his hero, maybe even get a chance to showcase his own talent. He was small in stature, weighing maybe 130 pounds, a stark contrast to the hulking figure of C-Murder. The tragedy began not with a gun, but with a look. In the warped logic of the VIP section, Steve Thomas stood too close, or looked too long, or perhaps said something that the rap star perceived as a slight. It was a moment of ego, of toxic entitlement. Witnesses reported that C-Murder and his crew didn't just ignore the kid, they swarmed him. It started as a beatdown, a group of grown men led by a multi-platinum artist cornering a 16-year-old boy and stomping him. It was a chaotic, brutal assault in the middle of a crowded dance floor. But a beating wasn't enough. The violence escalated from bullying to execution in a heartbeat. According to witnesses who would later testify, despite immense fear for their own lives, C-Murder reached into his waistband. He pulled out a small, semi-automatic handgun. He didn't fire wildly, he fired a single shot directly into the chest of the boy who was already on the ground. The muzzle flash lit up the dark club. Steve Thomas collapsed, his lungs pierced. The music stopped, replaced by screams. And then, in a display of chilling arrogance, C-Murder and his crew simply walked out. They didn't run, they left the scene as if they owned it, stepping over the body of the fan who had just wanted to see his idol. Steve Thomas died there on the floor of the Platinum Club, his life extinguished for absolutely nothing. The investigation that followed was a nightmare of witness intimidation. In New Orleans, the no-snitching code was enforced with lethal consequences. People who saw the shooting were terrified to speak. They knew C-Murder had money, power, and connections. The police struggled to build a case because witnesses would give statements and then recant them days later, clearly under duress. But the physical reality of the murder remained. A boy was dead, and the most famous man in the building was the one holding the gun. Corey Miller was arrested and charged with second-degree murder. His defense was vigorous, funded by the deep pockets of the no-limit empire. He claimed he was the victim of a setup, that the police were targeting him because of his fame and his name. He argued that someone else in the chaotic club had fired the shot. He released albums from prison, maintaining his innocence, rallying his fan base. But the legal system, flawed as it was, eventually closed in. After a series of trials, overturned verdicts, and retrials that spanned years, a jury in 2009 looked at the evidence and the testimony of the brave few who stood up, and they found him guilty. The judge sentenced Corey C. Murder to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He was sent to the Louisiana State Penitentiary at Angola, one of the most notorious and brutal prisons in the United States, a former slave plantation where inmates worked the fields. It was the ultimate fall. He went from the top of the Billboard charts, wearing gold tanks and driving Bentleys, to a concrete cell where he will likely die. The tragedy of C. Murder is the tragedy of the leaving your own hype. He was a man who had everything: wealth, talent, a platform, but he was so committed to the gangsta image, so addicted to the reputation of being hard, that he murdered a child to prove a point that no one needed proving. He named himself C. Murder, and in the end, he lived up to it, proving that when you glorify death long enough, it eventually comes for you, but not before it takes the innocent along with it. He remains in Angola today, still fighting his conviction with the help of high-profile advocates, but for the family of Steve Thomas, the verdict was delivered the night the music stopped in the Platinum Club.
Number 4. Big Lurch. We descend now into the absolute deepest, darkest pit of the music industry, leaving behind the calculated violence of gang disputes and entering the realm of pure, chemical-induced psychosis. This is a case that makes Scarface look like a Disney movie and makes the most violent gangster rap lyrics seem like nursery rhymes. We are exploring the subgenre known as Horrorcore, a style of hip-hop defined by graphic, over-the-top lyrics about murder, serial killers, and the macabre. For almost every artist in this genre, from the Ghetto Boys to Eminem, the violence is a metaphor, a cinematic persona adopted for shock value in storytelling. But for Antron Singleton, known to the underground as Big Lurch, the persona became a prophecy, and the horror lyrics became a literal instruction manual for one of the most gruesome crimes in American history. This is not a story about a robbery or a beef. This is a story about a man who broke his own mind with a drug so powerful and so evil that it turned a rising rap star into a literal cannibal. The details of this case are difficult to comprehend because they strip away the veneer of humanity entirely, exposing what happens when the brain is hijacked by a chemical demon that erases the line between man and beast. Big Lurch was a Texas rapper with a promising future, a flow that was gaining traction on the West Coast, and a towering 6'4" frame that made him an imposing figure in the booth. But by 2002, his career was being eclipsed by his addiction to PCP, also known as angel dust. PCP is a dissociative anesthetic that detaches the user from reality, induces hallucinations, and often triggers incredible feats of strength and extreme animalistic violence. For Big Lurch, PCP wasn't a recreational drug, it was the fuel for a nightmare that he would never wake up from. The unfolded in April 2002 in a gritty apartment in South Los Angeles. Big Lurch was living in a crash pad with several other people, a place where music was made and drugs were consumed in equal measure. Among the residents was Tanisha Isais, a 21-year-old mother of 2. She was not an enemy, she was a roommate, a friend, someone in his circle. On the night of April 10th, the atmosphere in the apartment shifted from a party to a scene from hell. Big Lurch had been smoking PCP heavily for days, not sleeping, not eating, just existing in a state of chemically induced delirium. According to later psychiatric evaluations and court testimony, his mind snapped. The hallucinations took over. He reportedly believed that the devil was in the apartment, that the world was ending, and that he was fighting for his soul. In his warped, shattered reality, Tanisha Isais ceased to be a human woman and became an entity, a demon that had to be destroyed.
What happened next is a sequence of violence so primal it baffled the seasoned LAPD homicide detectives who arrived on the scene. Big Lurch attacked Tanisha. He didn't use a gun. He used a kitchen knife, but when the knife broke, he used his hands and his teeth. The assault was not just a murder, it was a desecration. The police were not called to the apartment initially. They were called to the street. Neighbors reported a naked African-American man covered in blood, standing in the middle of the road, staring at the sky and howling like a wolf. When the patrol cars arrived, they found Big Lurch. He was in a catatonic state, oblivious to the commands to get down. He was drenched in blood, but he had no wounds on his own body. He was growling, barking, and snapping at the air. It took multiple officers to subdue him, as the PCP had given him a terrifying, numbing strength. They arrested him, assuming he was a victim of an assault, or perhaps a suspect in a street fight. But when they backtrailed his trail of blood to the apartment building, they found the source. The door was open. Inside, they found the body of Tanisha Isais. She had been butchered. Her chest had been torn open. Her lungs had been removed. And most horrifying of all, there were bite marks on her face and body. The medical examiner would later make a discovery that turned this case into a national horror story. Parts of Tanisha's lungs were found inside Big Lurch's stomach. He had not just killed her, he had consumed her flesh. He had become the cannibal he rapped about in his horrorcore songs, specifically a track titled "I Did It to You," where he spoke about eating humans. The lyrics had manifested into a bloody reality. When Big Lurch woke up in the jail cell days later, the PCP had worn off. He had no memory of the event. He asked the detectives why he was there. When they told him, when they showed him the pictures and explained what he had done to his friend, he reportedly broke down, unable to process the enormity of his actions. He claimed he thought he was fighting the devil. His defense attorney, Milton Grimes, who had famously represented Rodney King, attempted to mount an insanity defense, arguing that Big Lurch was in a drug-induced psychosis and could not form the intent to kill. They argued that he was legally insane at the time of the act. However, the prosecution countered with a harsh legal reality. Voluntary intoxication is not a defense for murder. In the eyes of the law, Big Lurch chose to smoke the PCP. He chose to enter that state. Therefore, he was responsible for everything he did while in that state, no matter how monstrous. They pointed to his lyrics as proof of a depraved mind, arguing that the violence was already inside him, waiting for the drug to unlock it. The jury agreed. The brutality of the crime left no room for sympathy. In 2003, Antron Big Lurch was found guilty of first-degree murder and torture. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He currently resides in the California Healthcare Facility, a prison for inmates with medical and mental health needs. His story is the ultimate cautionary tale of the drug culture. He was a man who flirted with the imagery of horror, who sold the fantasy of being a monster, only to take a drug that erased his humanity and turned him into the very thing he pretended to be. Tanisha Isais paid the price for his trip with her life, leaving 2 children without a mother. Big Lurch sits in a cell today, a sober man, haunted by the memory of a crime he committed while his mind was on another planet. A living testament to the fact that when you invite the devil in, you don't get to control what he does with your hands. This case remains the darkest stain on hip-hop history, a moment where the music, the drugs, and the madness collided in a tragedy that no rhyme can ever explain.
Number 5. Raw Diggs. In the history of hip-hop, there has always been a debate about the studio gangster, the artist who performs a character for the cameras but lives a safe suburban life when the lens is off. But in the Gowanus houses of Brooklyn, New York, during the late 2000s, there was no character, no performance, and absolutely no separation between the music and the madness. There was only Ronald Herron, known to the streets and the YouTube algorithm as Raw Diggs. He represents a terrifying evolution in the genre of gangster rap, a figure who didn't use music to escape the hood, but rather used it as a propaganda tool to terrorize it. Raw Diggs was not an aspiring rapper who happened to know criminals. He was a high-ranking leader of the murderous Mad Dogs, a savage faction of the Blood Street Gang, who happened to rap. His music videos were not artistic expressions. They were documentaries of his criminal enterprise, filmed in the very projects he held hostage with fear and violence. This is the story of a man who committed the ultimate act of dry snitching on himself, a warlord who felt so untouchable, so insulated by the fear he instilled in his community, that he literally tweeted at the district attorney, taunting them about the bodies he had dropped. We're investigating the 10 most shocking cases where rappers turned their lyrics into real crimes. This case stands out because Raw Diggs arguably provides the clearest example of rap lyrics as evidence in the history of the American legal system, a precedent that changed how prosecutors look at music videos forever. To understand the reign of terror of Raw Diggs, you have to walk through the Gowanus houses between 2001 and 2010. He was the big homie, the general of a drug trafficking operation that moved massive amounts of crack and heroin. He walked the grounds wearing body armor, surrounded by soldiers, operating with a level of impunity that is usually reserved for fictional villains in movies like New Jack City. Raw Diggs had already beaten the system once. In 2001, he was tried for a murder, but was acquitted because witnesses were too terrified to testify against him. This victory emboldened him to a pathological degree. He believed he was invincible, a god of the projects who could kill without consequence. He began to flood the internet with music videos. In songs like Slow Down Freestyle and Project Nigga, he didn't just rhyme, he confessed. He stood in front of the camera, surrounded by real guns and real gang members, and rapped about the specific murders he had committed and the ones he planned to commit. He bragged about being the leader of the killer team. He famously tweeted, "Ask the DA, I beat a body," a direct public mockery of the justice system that had failed to hold him accountable. But while he was building his online brand, he was leaving a trail of bodies in the real world. The most notorious of these killings was the execution of Frederick Brooks in June 2008. Brooks was a rival, a man Raw Diggs felt had disrespected his authority. In broad daylight, in the courtyard of the Gowanus houses, Raw Diggs and his crew hunted him down. They shot him. And then, to ensure the message was received by the entire community, they stood over him and finished the job. It was a mob-style hit, performed with an arrogance that suggested they knew no one would call 911. But Raw Diggs didn't stop there. He was also linked to the murders of Richard Russo and Victor Zapata, killings that were carried out to protect his drug territory and eliminate anyone who threatened his grip on the neighborhood. The downfall of Raw Diggs came from his own vanity. The NYPD and federal agents were watching his YouTube channel. They weren't just fans, they were building a RICO case. They treated his music videos not as art, but as overt acts in a criminal conspiracy. They analyzed the background of the videos to identify gang members. They broke down the lyrics to match them with unsolved shootings. Raw Diggs was essentially handing the prosecution the script for his own trial. When the feds finally swooped in, they didn't just charge him with drug dealing. They charged him with 21 counts, including racketeering, drug trafficking, and 3 murders. The trial in 2014 was a showdown between the First Amendment and criminal justice. Raw Diggs' defense team tried to argue that his persona was just that, a persona. They claimed he was a storyteller, a chronicler of the ghetto, and that his violent lyrics were hyperbolic artistic expressions, not confessions. They argued that putting him on trial for his rap lyrics was a violation of his freedom of speech. But the prosecution had a devastating counter-argument. They didn't just play the songs, they brought in the witnesses. They brought in the people who had lived under his boot for a decade. They connected the specific lines in his songs to the specific crime scene photos. When Raw Diggs rapped about shooting rivals, the prosecution showed the jury the autopsy reports of the rivals he shot. The art was revealed to be a diary of destruction. The jury didn't see a rapper, they saw a predator. They saw a man who had terrorized a community and then monetized that terror on the internet. In June 2014, Ronald "Raw" Diggs Heron was found guilty on all counts. The sentencing in 2015 was historic in its severity. The judge, Nicholas Garafias, looked at the man who had declared himself the king of Gowanus and delivered a sentence designed to ensure he never breathed free air again. Raw Diggs was sentenced to 12 terms of life in prison plus 105 years. It was a staggering number, a symbolic crushing of a man who thought he was bigger than the law. The judge stated that Raw Diggs had sentenced the residents of the Gowanus houses to a life of fear, and now the court was returning the favor. Raw Diggs remains in a high-security federal penitentiary, a living monument to the dangers of believing your own hype. His case set a controversial precedent regarding the use of rap lyrics in court, a debate that continues to rage today with artists like Young Thug. But for the people of Gowanus, the verdict wasn't about legal theory, it was about liberation. The man who turned their home into a war zone and his life into a violent reality show was finally canceled, proving that, while you can rap about beating a body, you can't rap your way out of a RICO charge when the feds have been subscribing to your channel the whole time.
Number 6. Cool C. We travel back in time to the golden age of hip-hop, the late 1980s, to uncover a tragedy that proves the fall from grace is often far more dangerous than the climb to the top. This is the story of Christopher Roney, known to the world as Cool C, a rapper who wasn't known for gangster rap or violent threats, but for a smooth, radio-friendly hit that celebrated wealth, fashion, and success. His breakout single, Glamorous Life, was an anthem of aspiration, a song about making it big and enjoying the finer things. He was a star in Philadelphia, a contemporary of Will Smith and DJ Jazzy Jeff, a young man who had tasted the sweet nectar of fame and fortune. But the music industry is fickle, and by the mid-1990s, the spotlight had shifted. The glamorous life was over, the money had dried up, the phone stopped ringing. And Cool C, unable to accept a return to normalcy, unable to let go of the lifestyle he felt entitled to, decided to get his money the old-fashioned way. But he didn't turn to drug dealing or hustling, he turned to armed robbery. This is the devastating account of a bank heist gone wrong, a morning that turned a fading pop rapper into a cop killer, and a crime that left a city mourning its first female officer lost in the line of duty. We are investigating the 10 most shocking cases where rappers turned their lyrics into real crimes. In this case, the lyrics were about glamour, but the reality was a cold, gritty, and lethal desperation that destroyed multiple lives in a matter of seconds. To understand the crime of Cool C, you have to understand the desperation of a has-been. By 1996, Christopher Roney was 26 years old. He was watching his peers rise while he fell. He teamed up with another fading Philadelphia rapper, Warren McGlone, known as Steady B, and another local man, Mark Canty. They weren't planning a comeback album, they were planning a tactical assault on a PNC bank. On the morning of January 2, 1996, the plan went into motion. It was the day after New Year's Day, a time when banks are often flush with cash and security can be lax. The trio arrived at the PNC Bank branch on Rising Sun Avenue in Philadelphia. They weren't wearing masks in the traditional sense, they were brazen. Cool C and Mark Canty entered the bank with guns drawn. Steady B was the getaway driver, waiting outside in a stolen minivan, the engine running, ready to whisk them away to a new life of stolen wealth. Inside the bank, terror took over. Cool C and Canty jumped the counter, they threatened the tellers, they demanded the money. It was a scene straight out of a movie, but the reality of violence was about to crash down on them. While the robbery was in progress, the silent alarm was tripped. The call went out to the Philadelphia Police Department. The closest officer was Laretha Baird. Officer Baird was a 43-year-old single mother of 2 boys. She was a 9-year veteran of the force, a respected, tough, and dedicated public servant who was just doing her job. She responded to the call alone, the first unit on the scene. She pulled her cruiser up to the bank, stepped out, and walked toward the entrance, unaware that she was walking into an ambush laid by a man who once rapped about champagne and limousines. As Officer Baird entered the bank door, gun drawn but not yet raised, she was met by Cool C. He was standing near the entrance, acting as the lookout and enforcer. There was no hesitation. There was no warning. Christopher Roney, the man who wanted the glamorous life, raised his 9mm semi-automatic pistol, and fired. He didn't shoot to wound, he shot to kill. The bullet struck Officer Verde in the abdomen, piercing her bulletproof vest in a vulnerable spot or striking just above it. Reports vary on the ballistics, but the result was fatal. She collapsed instantly in the doorway of the bank. Cool C didn't stop to check on her, he didn't show remorse. He stepped over the dying officer and fled the bank with Canty. They jumped into the minivan where Steady B was waiting, and they sped off, leaving a mother dying on the floor and a city in shock. They got away with nothing. The robbery was a failure. In the chaos, they had dropped the money bags. They had killed a police officer for absolutely zero financial gain. It was a crime of supreme incompetence and supreme evil. Officer Verde was rushed to the hospital, but she was pronounced dead. She became the first female officer in the history of the Philadelphia Police Department to be murdered in the line of duty. The city was outraged. The manhunt was massive. The police quickly tracked the getaway van. They found evidence. They found fingerprints. And they found the rappers. The arrest of Cool C and Steady B sent shockwaves through the hip-hop community. These weren't unknown thugs. These were guys who had been on Yo MTV Raps. The trial was a somber affair. The prosecution painted a picture of greed and callousness. They argued that Cool C was the trigger man, the one who made the split-second decision to take a life rather than face arrest. Cool C maintained his innocence, claiming he wasn't there, but the eyewitness testimony and the forensic evidence were overwhelming. The jury didn't see a celebrity. They saw a cop killer. In 1996, Christopher Cool C. Roney was found guilty of first-degree murder. The penalty phase was emotional. The jury heard about the life of Laretha Verde, about the 2 boys she left behind, about the hole her death left in the community. They weighed that against the life of a rapper who threw it all away. The verdict was unanimous. Death. Cool C was sentenced to die by lethal injection. His accomplice, Steady B, was sentenced to life in prison without parole. For the last nearly 30 years, Cool C has sat on death row in Pennsylvania. He has faced multiple execution dates. In 2006, he was days away from execution when a stay was granted. In 2015, another execution date was set, and again, he received a last-minute stay from a judge. He remains there today, an aging man in a solitary cell, fighting a legal battle that seems to have no end. His story is the ultimate inversion of the hip-hop dream. He wanted the glamorous life, but his greed led him to the grim reality of a death row cell. He proved that the distance between the top of the charts and the bottom of the barrel is shorter than anyone thinks, and that when you trade a microphone for a 9mm, the only audience you have left is a jury of your peers, and they don't applaud. This case stands as a permanent stain on the golden age of rap, a reminder that the artists we danced to were capable of acts that would make us weep.
Number 7. X-rated. Long before YNW Melly sat in a Florida courtroom listening to Murder on My Mind, and decades before the Young Thug RICO trial turned rap lyrics into a constitutional debate, there was Patient Zero. There was a case in Sacramento, California in the early 1990s that established the terrifying precedent that your art could be used to lock you in a cage for the rest of your life. This is the story of Onare Brown, known to the streets and the history books of West Coast hip-hop as X-rated. He was a prodigy of the horrorcore and gangsta rap genres, a young man with a flow as rapid and deadly as the automatic weapons he rapped about. He was a member of the Garden Block Crips, a notorious set that controlled parts of South Sacramento with an iron fist. But X-rated wasn't just a foot soldier. He was a voice, a storyteller who documented the brutal reality of gang warfare with a precision that was uncomfortable for the authorities. In 1992, he released his debut album, Exorcist, a classic of the genre that is filled with violent imagery, threats, and detailed descriptions of home invasions. To his fans, it was a masterpiece of street reporting. To the Sacramento Police Department and the district attorney, it wasn't an album, it was a confession. This is the chilling story of a home invasion that went horribly wrong, a mother who paid the price for a gang feud she had nothing to do with, and a rapper whose album cover became the primary evidence in his own murder trial. We're investigating the 10 most shocking cases where rappers turned their lyrics into real crimes. This case is pivotal because it blurred the line between performer and predator so completely that the legal system decided they were one and the same. To understand the fall of X-Rated, you have to understand the war zone of 1992 Sacramento. The tension between the Garden Block Crips and the Meadowview Bloods was at a boiling point. It wasn't about music, it was about territory, colors, and revenge. On the night of March 15, 1992, X-Rated and 3 other members of his gang decided to strike. They were looking for retribution. They believed that rival gang members were living in a specific house in the Meadowview neighborhood. They armed themselves. X-Rated, the leader of the pack, was carrying a .38 caliber handgun. They didn't creep in the shadows. They kicked down the door. It was a military-style raid, a home invasion executed with the intent to kill. But when they burst into the living room, they didn't find rival gang members. They found Patricia Harris. Patricia was a 42-year-old mother, a community member, a woman who had absolutely nothing to do with the gang war consuming her city. She was an innocent bystander in her own sanctuary. The realization that they had the wrong house or the wrong target didn't stop the violence. In the chaos of the invasion, shots were fired. One of X-Rated's accomplices opened fire. Patricia Harris was shot and killed in her own home. The gang fled into the night, leaving a family destroyed and a community in shock. It was a senseless, cowardly act of violence that stripped away any glamour associated with the gang lifestyle. It wasn't a war against soldiers, it was the slaughter of a civilian. The investigation that followed was intense. The police quickly identified the Garden Block Crips as the perpetrators. When they arrested X-Rated, they found something that made their case stronger than any witness testimony could. They found the murder weapon. But they didn't just find the gun, they found a picture of it. On the cover of X-Rated's debut album, Exorcist, the rapper is depicted holding a gun to his head. When ballistics experts examined the gun used to kill Patricia Harris, they realized it was a .38 caliber revolver. When they looked at the album cover, they realized it was the exact same gun. X-Rated had posed for his album artwork with the weapon that was used in a homicide. The art and the crime were inextricably linked. But the prosecution didn't stop there. During the trial, they did something that was revolutionary and controversial at the time. They played the music. They played tracks from Exorcist for the jury. They had the jurors read the lyrics sheets. They pointed to songs where X-Rated rapped about breaking into homes, about shooting rivals with a .38, about the specific tactics used in the murder of Patricia Harris. They argued that these weren't stories, they were plans, they were journals. They argued that X-Rated wasn't playing a character, he was documenting his life. The defense tried to argue that rap is an art form, like cinema, and no one would put creating a horror movie on trial, but the physical evidence of the gun on the cover was too damning. The lyrics were the narrative, and the gun was the proof. The jury didn't see an artist. They see a gang leader who had led a raid that killed a mother. In 1996, Anarle Brown, X-Rated, was convicted of first-degree murder, largely on the theory of aiding and abetting, as he was present and armed, even if he wasn't the one who fired the fatal shot. He was sentenced to 31 to life in prison. But the story of X-Rated didn't end in a cell. In many ways, it just began. He became a legend of the prison system. While incarcerated, he continued to record music. He famously recorded vocals over the prison phone or via smuggled recording equipment, releasing albums like Unforgiven from behind bars. His voice became even more respected because the audience knew he was living the hard time he spoke about. He spent 26 years in prison, but unlike many on this list who rotted away or became worse, X-Rated evolved.
He spent his time educating himself. He renounced his gang affiliation. He began to express genuine remorse for the death of Patricia Harris and the pain he had caused. He became a model prisoner, a man who used his time to understand the consequences of his actions. In a rare turn of events for a lifer, he was granted parole. In September 2018, after serving 26 years, X-Rated walked out of prison a free man. He was 43 years old. He had gone in as a teenager and came out a middle-aged man. Since his release, he has become a powerful voice for reform, working with artists like Tech-9 and speaking openly about the dangers of the lifestyle he once glorified. His story is a complex arc of tragedy, crime, punishment, and ultimately, redemption. But it stands as a permanent warning to every rapper who thinks their lyrics exist in a vacuum. X-Rated proved that if you rap about the life and then live the life, the legal system will use your own voice to lock the door behind you. He survived the race that Tay-K lost, but he paid for it with the best years of his life, leaving behind a legacy that is forever tied to the album cover that solved a murder.
Number 8. G-Dep. In the lexicon of criminal history, there is a fundamental rule that every outlaw, every gangster, and every fugitive lives by. You do not talk to the police. You do not snitch on your friends, and you certainly never, under any circumstances, snitch on yourself. But in the strange, haunted life of Travell Coleman, known to the hip-hop world as G-Dep, the rules of the street were ultimately overruled by the crushing weight of a human conscience. This is the most unique and psychologically fascinating case on our list, because it is the only one where the rapper wasn't caught by a detective, wasn't betrayed by a snitch, and wasn't trapped by forensic evidence. He was a man who had successfully committed the perfect crime, a man who had gotten away with murder for nearly 2 decades, rising to the top of the music industry while harboring a secret that was slowly eating him alive from the inside out. This is the story of the star of Bad Boy Records, the man who gave us the Harlem Shake and the smash hit Special Delivery, who traded his freedom for redemption in a move that baffled the legal system and the streets alike. We are investigating the 10 most shocking cases where rappers turn their lyrics into reality. Usually the lyrics are used to catch them. In the case of G-Dep, the lyrics were a mask for a pain so deep that he eventually walked into a police precinct and handed over his life. To understand the confession, you have to go back to the era before the shiny suits and the P. Diddy videos. You have to go back to the cold, unforgiving streets of East Harlem in the early 1990s. Before he was G-Dep, which stood for Ghetto Dependent, Travell Coleman was just another kid trying to survive the crack epidemic and the violence of New York City. On the night of October 19, 1993, Travell was 18 years old. He wasn't a star, he was desperate, high, and armed. He was prowling the neighborhood near Park Avenue and East 114th Street. He wasn't looking for a record deal, he was looking for a victim. He spotted a man named John Henkel. Henkel was 32 years old, a Queens native who had come into the neighborhood purportedly to buy drugs. To Travell, he was just a target, an opportunity for a quick robbery. Travell approached him. He pulled out a .40 caliber handgun. He demanded money. What happened next was a fumble, a panic, a squeeze of the trigger that changed 2 timelines forever. Travell fired 3 shots. One of them struck John Henkel in the chest. The robbery was botched. Travell fled into the night without taking anything, leaving a dying man on the pavement. John Henkel died at St. Luke's Hospital. The police arrived, taped off the scene, and opened a file. But they had nothing. No witnesses, no weapon, no DNA. The case went cold almost immediately. It became just another unsolved number in a year where the murder rate in New York was skyrocketing. Travell Coleman had gotten away with it. He was a free man. 5 years later, the universe played a cruel joke on him. Travell Coleman became famous.
He signed a $350,000 5-album deal with Sean Puffy D's Bad Boy Records. He became G-Dep. He was suddenly on MTV, wearing expensive clothes, driving luxury cars, and performing for thousands of screaming fans. His song Special Delivery became an anthem. He helped popularize the Harlem Shake dance. He was living the dream that millions of kids would kill for. But while he was smiling in the movie videos, Travell was rotting. The secret of 1993 was a cancer. He tried to numb it with drugs. He developed a severe addiction to PCP, or angel dust, a dissociative drug that detaches the user from reality. But no amount of dust could wash away the face of John Henkel. His career began to suffer. He was dropped from Bad Boy. He spiraled into poverty and obscurity, a washed-up rapper haunting the same streets where he had found fame. By 2010, he was a shell of the man who had topped the charts. He was broke, addicted, and tormented. The guilt was no longer manageable. He believed that his failures, his addiction, and his misery were karmic punishments for the life he had taken. He decided he couldn't live with the ghost anymore. On December 15, 2010, Travell Coleman did the unthinkable. He walked into the 25th Precinct in East Harlem. He wasn't in handcuffs. He walked up to the front desk officer. He didn't ask for help. He asked to confess. He told the stunned officers, "I shot someone back in '93. At first, the police didn't believe him. It sounded like the ramblings of a drug addict. They checked the cold case files. They looked for a shooting in 1993 on Park Avenue. And then they found it. The file of John Henkel. The details matched. The location matched. The weapon caliber matched. The police were stunned. They had solved a 17-year-old cold case without lifting a finger. They contacted John Henkel's family, who had spent nearly 2 decades wondering who had killed their brother and son. The news that the killer was a famous rapper who had been on TV the whole time was a shock that is hard to describe. G-Dep was arrested and charged with murder. The hip-hop community was confused. Why would he snitch on himself? Why would he throw away his life when he was in the clear? In interviews from Rikers Island, G-Dep explained that he wanted balance. He wanted to clear his soul. He felt that he couldn't move forward, couldn't be a father or a man as long as he was hiding a body in his past. The trial in 2012 was a formality. His confession was the evidence. His lawyer tried to argue that the police had coerced him or that his memory was faulty due to drug use, but G-Dep stood by his words. He was convicted of second-degree murder. The judge, acknowledging the bizarre nature of the confession but bound by the law, sentenced him to the minimum, 15 years to life in prison. G-Dep went to prison not kicking and screaming, but with a strange sense of peace. He had traded his physical freedom for spiritual freedom. He spent the next decade and a half behind bars, becoming a model prisoner, earning a college degree, and mentoring other inmates. And then, in a final twist to this redemption arc, the legal system recognized the uniqueness of his case. In December 2023, New York Governor Kathy Hochul granted him clemency. It was a rare act of mercy for a violent crime, acknowledging that he had served a significant time and that his confession was an act of genuine remorse. In April 2024, G-Dep walked out of the Fishkill Correctional Facility a free man. He was 49 years old. He had served 13 years for a crime he could have taken to his grave. His story stands alone in the history of gangster rap. He proved that while lyrics can be fake, the conscience is real, and sometimes the hardest person to run from is the one staring back at you in the mirror. He turned his lyrics into a crime, and then he turned his crime into a confession, rewriting the ending of a story that usually ends in silence.
Number 9. Kid Creole. To understand the sheer magnitude of this tragedy, you have to understand that we are not talking about a SoundCloud rapper or a one-hit wonder. We are talking about a founding father. We are talking about a man whose DNA is woven into the very double helix of hip-hop itself. Nathaniel Glover, known to history as Kid Creole, was a member of Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five. They were the pioneers.
the first rap group to be inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, the men who took the block party energy of the Bronx and gave it a global voice with The Message, a song that is universally recognized as one of the greatest recordings of the 20th century. They rapped about the jungle, about the broken glass and the struggle of the inner city, but they did it to shine a light on the darkness, not to glorify it. Kid Creole was royalty. He was a legend who had traveled the world, stood on the biggest stages, and helped invent a genre that would dominate the planet. But fame is a fleeting, fickle mistress. And by 2017, the bright lights of the 1980s had long since faded into the gray reality of a working-class grind. This is the devastating story of a pioneer who fell from the heights of the Hall of Fame to the depths of a prison cell because of a single, paranoid, and violent misunderstanding on a Manhattan street corner. It is a case that exposes the fragile ego of a faded star and the lethal consequences of toxic masculinity when it is armed with a steak knife. We are investigating the 10 most shocking cases where rappers turned their lives into crime scenes. Usually, we look at young men trying to prove they are tough. In this case, we look at a 57-year-old grandfather who proved that you can take the man out of the jungle, but the fear of the jungle never truly leaves the man. The timeline of the murder takes us to the sweltering evening of August 1st, 2017. Nathaniel Glover was no longer living the life of a rap superstar. He was working. He had a job as a security guard and handyman in Midtown Manhattan, a respectable, quiet existence for a man who had once worn leather and furs. He walked the same route to work every day, a path that took him through the bustling, anonymous crowds of New York City. But Nathaniel Glover was carrying a secret, a weapon that suggested he was still living in a war zone in his mind. Taped to his forearm, hidden beneath his shirt sleeve, was a steak knife. He carried it, he would later claim, for protection, a remnant of a life where danger was always around the corner. But on this night, the danger wasn't real. It was imagined. As he walked past East 44th Street and 3rd Avenue, he encountered a man named John Jolly. Jolly was 55 years old, a homeless man who had struggled with addiction and had served time in prison for sexual assault. He was a drifter, a ghost in the city, invisible to most. But on this night, he saw Glover. What happened next was a collision of two worlds that ended in bloodshed. According to surveillance footage and Glover's own confession, John Jolly spoke to him. It was a simple interaction. Jolly reportedly said, "What's up?" or made a comment that Glover interpreted as a sexual advance. Glover, fueled by a sudden homophobic panic and an intense need to assert his dominance, snapped. He didn't ignore the man. He didn't keep walking. He turned around. He confronted the homeless man. The Grandmaster became the aggressor. Glover closed the distance. He pulled the steak knife from his sleeve. It was a move straight out of an assassin movie, practiced and cold. He didn't brandish the weapon to scare Jolly off. He used it. He plunged the knife into John Jolly's chest, stabbing him twice. It was a brutal, excessive reaction to a few words. John Jolly collapsed on the sidewalk, bleeding out in the middle of one of the busiest cities on earth. And then Kid Creole did something that chilled the investigators to the bone. He didn't call for help. He didn't panic. He simply turned around and walked to his workplace, just a few blocks away. He went into the bathroom, washed the blood off the knife, changed his shirt, and started his shift. He sat there, guarding a building, while a man lay dying on the pavement a few hundred yards away because of him. John Jolly died at Bellevue Hospital shortly after. The police investigation was swift because Manhattan is the most watched island in the world. Cameras captured the entire incident. They captured him walking to the scene, the altercation, and his walk away. When the NYPD arrested him the next day, the hip-hop community was stunned. How could a legend, a man who preached peace and unity in the early days, become a murderer over a what's up? In his interrogation, Glover tried to frame the narrative as self-defense.
He claimed he thought Jolly was going to rob him or hurt him. He played the gay panic card, suggesting that he felt threatened by the man's perceived flirtation. But the video evidence told a different story. Jolly was unarmed. He was intoxicated. He was barely standing. He posed no physical threat to Glover. The stabbing wasn't defense. It was an execution born of annoyance and a warped sense of pride. The trial was a sad, somber affair. The prosecution painted Glover not as a legend, but a man with a hair-triggered temper who carried a deadly weapon looking for an excuse to use it. They argued that carrying a knife taped to your arm isn't protection. It's premeditation. It's the behavior of someone waiting for a fight. The defense tried to lean on his legacy and his fear, but the jury saw the facts. A homeless man was dead because a former rap star didn't like the way he looked at him. In 2022, Nathaniel Kid Creole was found guilty of first-degree manslaughter. He was acquitted of second-degree murder, meaning the jury believed he intended to cause serious harm, but perhaps not death. But the result was the same: a life destroyed. The judge sentenced the 62-year-old legend to 16 years in prison. He will likely spend the rest of his life behind bars. The tragedy of Kid Creole is the tragedy of a man who couldn't adjust to the quiet life. He was a pioneer who helped build a culture that eventually outgrew him. And in his frustration and paranoia, he lashed out at the most vulnerable person he could find. He went from being a voice of the people to a prisoner of the state, proving that history doesn't care who you used to be, it only cares about what you did tonight. The message he left behind wasn't a song. It was a warning that pride comes before the fall, and sometimes the fall is fatal.
Number 10. Cassidy. We end our investigation in the birthplace of America, Philadelphia, a city with a hip-hop history as gritty as its boxing legacy. This is the story of Barry Adrian Reese, known to the world as Cassidy. In the mid-2000s, Cassidy was the undisputed prince of battle rap, a lyricist who made his name destroying opponents on street corners before transitioning to mainstream superstardom with hits like Hotel. His entire brand was built on being the sharpest, toughest man in the room. But the tragedy of Cassidy is that he blurred the line between the sport of lyrical warfare and the deadly reality of street violence. On April 15, 2005, in the West Oak Lane section of Philadelphia, a petty dispute with a rival named Desmond Hawkins escalated into a military-grade shootout that turned a residential neighborhood into a war zone. Hawkins and his crew drove to Cassidy's house to settle a disagreement, an act that, in the logic of the streets, is a declaration of war. They were met not with words, but with an arsenal. Cassidy and his associates were armed with .45 caliber handguns, 9mm pistols, and an AK-47 assault rifle. The ensuing firefight was chaotic and brutal, spraying the street with bullets and leaving Desmond Hawkins dead from a shot to the back. Cassidy, the platinum-selling artist, was suddenly facing the death penalty for first-degree murder. The media circus was intense, painting him as a gang leader who ordered an execution. However, the trial ended in a verdict that stunned the city. The jury acquitted him of murder, accepting the argument that the shootout was a chaotic act of self-defense rather than a premeditated killing. He was convicted only of involuntary manslaughter and released after serving just 8 months in prison. Cassidy walked away a free man, but the incident remains a grim reminder that when rappers turn their gun bars into reality, the consequences are irreversible, proving that the most dangerous battles aren't fought on the microphone, but in the streets, where there are no referees to stop the fight.